was made from the silver half shekel given. Temptation,
There's a common argument that the world is a smaller place now, at least smaller than it used to be. There are more signals, there's more connectivity, there are more nexus points by which to access, well, more. So let's think about time-space compression. Movement and communication across space, which affects social relations and how we experience daily interactions due to time-destroying space. This is considered to be a default setting for many of us. Massey writes about how this impacts perceptions of place. And this is where things get cool. So, the first thing you have to know in terms of having a global sense of place is that idealizing place, fetishizing it, is counterproductive. It's important to be aware of this because it gets really easy to swallow the quote, remember, unquote potion, which makes you start to get sentimental and protective of how you view place. In other words, place, and the quest for it, has, in Massey's words, quote, come to be seen by some as necessarily reactionary. Easy enough, right? So this is where you might be tempted to go, okay, I got it. What's next on the reading list? Massey presses on with an important question. Can we imagine a progressive sense of place, one that's not exclusionary, bounded, or as she put it, defensive, but actually outward-looking? Massey skips back to the default setting of time-space compression. Here she inquires into the whos of time-space compression more so than the what of it. In less tricky terms, Massey asks if the brand of time-space compression we've decided to, or more likely been forced to, identify with, is rooted in the perspective of the Western colonizer. Imagine this. You've lived in any town wherever all your life. Main Street has changed over time. It's not what your parents grew up with or even what you grew up with. This may just be progress, right? But perhaps you feel a little disjointed or uncomfortable about the changes. Is that new fancy Brazilian chicken restaurant down the block actually a form of cultural invasion? Is it a collection of concerns indicative of space being destroyed by a combination of immigration, production, trade, and knowledge regimes? This is why Massey presents the question of Eurocentrism in her essay. It's a provocative and effective exercise. I mean, how do you think other people felt when people from wherever showed up on their shores saying, hey, how about we make you subject to this king fella we have? But Massey's not done. She also suggests we think about what causes space-time compression to hit the levels of acceleration we've seen it reach. She acknowledges the role of capital, but goes on to point out that other factors play a role. Race and gender, for instance, both work to impact how we experience space. This is a key thing to understand. Massey writes how time-space compression, quote, has not been happening for everyone in all spheres of activity. There's a social differentiation at work here. William Gibson, the cyberpunk novelist, once talked about how the future was already here, it just wasn't evenly distributed at the moment. I suggest that now it's more of a question of whose future is here, because as Massey points out, there's a social differentiation factor at work that shouldn't be ignored. So if you're wondering why you're looking at a travel log, it's because we see this all around us in terms of flows. Think of all those ships, those planes, and those cars. Here we enter the realm of analyzing power geometries. Massey writes, quote, for different social groups and different individuals, are placed in very distinct ways in relation to these flows and interconnections. It's not just Bill moves or Susan moves, but also how power is related to those flows and these movements. Some get more than others, and some just suffer for it. Because the power of leveraging time-space compression is in the hands of the few, differentials in power and to power are crucial. And by the way, since I'm here, I should note how Massey mentions that this extends to academics as well. so trust me, I am a little nervous about turning this thing in. The big deal here is to think about your life. You'll watch videos like this one, which is hosted on a server in the ocean by way of a company in the Silicon Valley, on a laptop made in China, pour it out via an HDMI cable you had shipped in from Rancho Cucamonga, California, to a projector designed by a company in Korea, but which was built in Malaysia. You bought this while on vacation in Tokyo and had it shipped back to the US via the Japan Post, though you sent it to your uncle who has discounts at FedEx, so you got a speedier final delivery. That's a lot of interconnectivity, and a lot of movement, and a lot of flows to account for. Go beyond the what to the who. Think about who built your electronics, who mined the parts for them, who put them all together, who packaged those goods, who drove them to the shipping yard, who got injured putting them on a pallet. Really basic questions. Who made the ride across the ocean? Who dealt with the tariffs and the taxes that had to be paid on everything? I bring this up to reinforce Massey's point when she says, quote, "The ways in which people are placed within time-space compression are highly complicated and extremely varied." And again, think of the question of power here. Who has the power to command the nature of other people's relationships with power? What Massey is on about is mobility and control, which can weaken other people. Massey's topic may as well be the control of mobility and control itself. To be blunt, one group's control of time-space compression can be weaponized against other people. Massey suggests we look at our own roles here with regard to the nature of our daily lives. Are we doing something that could stack the cards against somebody else? Could we change it and create more equality or equity? So this is where Massey shifts to the local and how we view the local. She knows how some people view seeing place and the spatially local as regressive, but she does not agree pro forma. Instead of simplistic definitions or diversions from the tyranny of the power geometries of time-space compression, Massey suggests we look at how we might create what she calls, quote, "an adequately progressive sense of place," one which would fit in with the current global local time and the feeling and relations they give rise to, and which would be useful in what are, after all, political struggles often inevitably based on place. It's not wrong for people to want to feel an attachment for place. It's more about the nature of that attachment, and what it entails in a rich network of connections. One need not be a regressive nationalist here. Cool, right? Massey takes issue with how boundaries may be used as exclusionary devices, arguing they have minimal purchase and that places have multiple identities. Boundaries and borders gesture to simplistic, nuance-free interpretations of place which lack complexity and difference. Think of your relationship with the room you're in right now. Your relationship with your room would vary. It would be different from that of your neighbor, the person who built it, and the person who cut the wood for it and put in the window treatments and did the paneling and the insulation and painted it, etc., etc. And so, we're in a place where we're thinking about communities. And communities and place have an interesting relationship. Massey warns us away from viewing places and communities as synonymous entities. Furthermore, she writes how, quote, "people occupy different positions within any community." And this can lead us to consider the place of race and gender. People have different senses of place, and these can be applied to the communities in which they hold different positions. It's complicated but cool, right? Massey encourages us to think of the links between people on a global scale. She writes that instead of, quote, "thinking of places as areas with boundaries around, they could be imagined as articulated moments in networks of social relations and understandings, but where a larger population of those relations, experiences, and understandings are constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself, whether that be a street or a region or even a continent. In short, think of place as it relates to a much wider context. There are social, political, and cultural forces at work in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which go far beyond the city limits of Chapel Hill, North Carolina." Massey closes out her essay by arguing a few points. Her first, a key one, is that places are not static. They are processes. They do not have boundaries that, in Massey's words, frame simple enclosures. That's not to say they can't have boundaries or borders, but you don't need them to imagine the place. Which means you wouldn't think of a chicken restaurant as some kind of invasion. Aside from that, places should not be thought of as possessing singular identities, because there are going to be internal issues and conflicts there. A lot of this kind of tension can be explored in terms of community equality with regard to school funding, public housing, transportation, infrastructure, or safety policies. But here's the beauty. none of these stipulations disallows place from being unique. Massey contends, quote, the specificity of place is continually reproduced, end quote, from a host of different sources. There's a mix of the global and the local, the close and the far, and all the differences which influence their innumerable interactions and exchanges. History plays a role here as well, but history is also made up of these connections and relationships. We can thus think of place as an ongoing process, one made up of links, flows, and relationships which are continually created, maintained, redefined, altered, or even destroyed. For Massey, a progressive comprehension of place would see links and relations with the global without construing them as threats. I contend this requires owning up to the place of power, privilege, proximity, and flows in our lives so as to better trace our own connections and our own relationships. We are locked into movement and processes, even after processes have ended or have seemingly ended. We are already connected to the global in a number of ways. The next step is to look at our lives and ask how, so we can learn if we are amenable to the nature of these connections.